The star chart glowed on the table, and every light on it meant a living world. Every light except one. That one light was gray, and it had been gray for 100 years. Counselor Vex Amara, of the Thesson Compact, stood over the chart and looked at the gray light for a long moment. She had looked at it many times before, but today felt different. Today the reports had changed. "Say it again," she said. Slowly this time. The young officer at her side straightened his back. His name was Terrell, and he had never spoken to a full counselor before. His voice shook a little. A patrol ship near the edge of the old human border reported a signal. A strong one, military grade. It came from inside the quiet zone. "The quiet zone has been silent for a century," Vex said. "No signal has come from there since the humans stopped answering. Not one." "I know, counselor." "That is why the report was flagged." Vex sat down slowly. She was old for her species, old enough to remember when the humans were still part of galactic trade, still sending ships to the border markets, still arguing loudly in council meetings that species twice their size found either funny or frightening, depending on the day. She remembered when the silence began. She remembered the fear that came with it, and then the relief when nothing bad seemed to happen, and then, over decades, the slow forgetting. Humans became a story, a cautionary tale told to young officers. Do not provoke a species until you know what they can do. Do not assume silence means weakness. The humans went quiet, and for 100 years, nobody had a good reason to go looking for them. Their part of space was poor in resources, hard to reach, and guarded by old warning beacons that nobody wanted to test. So the galaxy left them alone, and the galaxy moved on. "Play the signal," Vex said. Terrell touched a panel, and the small speaker in the center of the table crackled. There was no message in it. No words, no code, nothing that made sense as communication. It was a pulse, deep and steady, like a heartbeat recorded from something enormous. It repeated 4 times, and then stopped. "Our analysts do not know what it is," Terrell said. "But there is one thing we are certain of. The pulse pattern was logged before. 104 years ago. It was recorded by a listening post on the border, 3 years before the humans went silent. Our old records call it an identification signal, a ship signature." "Whose ship?" Terrell hesitated before he answered. "The file calls it the Ashwood Sovereign, human designation, Dreadnought class. It was the largest warship humanity had ever built. Our old intelligence reports say it disappeared into deep space shortly before the humans stopped all outbound communication. We assumed it was lost, destroyed perhaps, in an accident, or scrapped when the humans withdrew from contact. We had no reason to think otherwise." Vex looked back at the gray light on the star chart. A century of silence, and now, without warning, one signal, matching a warship that everyone believed was gone. "Send word to the fleet command," she said, quietly. "I do not want to panic before we know what we are dealing with. And send someone to check the old human archives. I want to know everything we ever learned about that ship, and I want to know why it went silent along with everyone else." Terrell bowed and left the room. Vex remained, staring at the gray light, and for the first time in many years, she felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel around humans. She felt uncertain. 3 days later, at a listening station on the edge of Thesson space, a technician named Oven Dre sat with his boots on the console and a half-eaten meal beside his terminal. The night shift was usually the boring shift. Nothing much happened out here, at the far edge of civilized space, where the old human border used to be. Oven liked it that way. Boring meant safe. His console beeped. He sat up straight, because that particular tone meant a ship had entered detection range, and detection range out here started very, very far away, because there was almost nothing between this station and the deep dark that used to be human territory. He pulled his boots off the console and looked at the reading. Then he looked again, because the first look did not make sense. The ship was enormous. Not enormous in the way pirate raiders sometimes looked enormous on old sensors before turning out to be small ships with a strange radar signature. This was a real, solid mass reading, and it was bigger than anything Oven had ever tracked in his 6 years on this post. Bigger than a Thesson capital ship. Bigger, according to the size comparison chart his console pulled up automatically, than most planetary defense platforms. It was moving slowly, on a course that would take it past the station and deeper into settled space, toward the old trade lanes that used to connect a dozen species before the humans stopped using them. Owen's hands were shaking a little as he opened a channel to try to hail the ship. Protocol said to identify unknown contacts before anything else. He cleared his throat. Unidentified vessel. This is Thesson Listening Station, Perimeter 9. Please identify yourself and state your intentions. Silence. The ship kept moving, unbothered, uninterested, like a whale passing by a boat too small to matter. Owen tried again. Still nothing. He checked his sensors one more time, hoping he had made some kind of mistake with the size reading, hoping the ship was smaller than it looked, a trick of the old, half-broken long-range scanners this station used because nobody in command thought this posting was important enough to upgrade. The sensors held steady. The ship was real, and it was enormous, and it was heading toward the heart of settled space, without answering a single hail. Owen did the only thing he could think of. He flagged the contact as high priority, attached every sensor reading he had, and sent it straight to Fleet Command with a message at the top that said, in his own shaking words, "I think something very old just woke up." Far across the quiet zone, in the parts of space that the galaxy had stopped watching a century ago, humanity had not been quiet at all. When the last human transmission left the old border stations, back when the ships still argued in the compact council chambers, most of the galaxy assumed one of two things had happened. Either the humans had suffered some disaster that wiped out their ability to communicate, or they had chosen, for reasons nobody outside their species understood, to cut themselves off completely. Both guesses were half right, and mostly wrong. The truth was that 101 years ago, humanity had made a discovery that terrified its own leaders more than anything the wider galaxy had ever done to them. Deep in an unmapped stretch of space just past their border, an automated probe found the remains of a dead civilization, not dead from war. Dead from something else, something that had scoured entire star systems clean of life, and left behind nothing but broken structures and a warning beacon, still transmitting after who knew how many thousands of years, repeating the same message over and over, in a language that took human linguists 3 full years to translate. The message was simple, once it was understood. It said, in essence, they are still out there, and they are still hungry, and they will come again when there is enough to eat. Human leadership faced a choice. They could tell the galaxy what they found, and risk causing a panic that might do more harm than good, especially since nobody had proof beyond old ruins and a single beacon. Or they could quietly withdraw, build up their own strength in secret, and prepare for the possibility that whatever destroyed that ancient civilization might one day turn its attention toward the crowded, noisy part of the galaxy, where humans and a dozen other species now lived side by side. They chose the second option. It was not a popular choice, even among humans. There were arguments, protests, entire governments that fell because of the decision, but in the end, humanity closed its borders, stopped answering hails, pulled every outpost and trade ship back inside its own territory, and began the long, hard work of preparing for a threat that nobody else believed was real, because nobody else had seen the same evidence. For 100 years, humans did not sit quietly and wait. They built. They dug deeper into their home systems, expanded old asteroid mining operations into massive shipyards, poured resources into research that the rest of the galaxy would have found deeply alarming had they known about it. They studied every piece of the ancient warning they could find. They built weapons meant not to fight other people, but to fight something that could erase an entire civilization and leave barely a trace. And they built ships. Big ones. The Ashwood Sovereign, the dreadnought that once frightened distant sensor stations before the silence even began, had not been lost or scrapped. It had been the first of its kind, and over 100 years, humanity built more like it, and better, learning from every mistake, testing every system against threats real and imagined. The Sovereign itself never stopped serving. It had spent decades patrolling the deep dark past the human border, watching for any sign that the thing that killed that ancient civilization was moving closer. Its crew changed many times over the century, generation after generation of sailors trained from childhood for a war that, as the years passed without any sign of the enemy, some of them privately began to doubt would ever come. But 3 months before the signal reached Owen Dre's tired console at Perimeter 9, That doubt ended. Deep sensors aboard the Sovereign picked up something moving through the old dead system, where the ancient beacon still transmitted its warning. The Sovereign's captain, a woman named Commander Alina Reyes, had been in command for 9 years and had never once seen an actual contact worth reporting. That night, she saw something that made her call every officer to the bridge before the sensors had even finished their first sweep. It was not one ship, it was a swarm, thousands of small vessels moving together in a pattern too organized to be anything but a coordinated fleet, emerging from the direction of the dead system, moving slowly, patiently, the way something moves when it has all the time in the world and nothing to fear. Reyes watched the display for a long time before she spoke. "Well?" she said quietly, to no one in particular. "There it is." She gave the order to fall back, not because the Sovereign could not fight, but because one ship, however powerful, was not the answer to a fleet of that size. She gave the order to record everything, to send a full report home, and to prepare for the long journey back to human space, because for the first time in 100 years, the silence that had protected humanity was about to end, whether humanity was ready to end it or not. And somewhere between the dead system and human territory, 100 years of secrecy, 100 years of building weapons, meant for a nightmare instead of neighbors, was about to run straight into a galaxy that had almost forgotten humans existed at all. Back on the Sovereign's bridge, a young lieutenant named Marcus Webb stood watching the tactical display, where the swarm still glowed, distant but unmistakable. He had grown up hearing stories about the beacon, about the ancient warning, about the reason his grandparents' generation chose silence over safety in numbers. He had always half believed the stories were exaggerated, the kind of thing older generations told to keep young people disciplined and afraid of complacency. He did not think that anymore. "Commander," he said. "Orders?" Reyes did not look away from the display. "We go home," she said. "We tell them it's real, and then we find out if 100 years was enough time to get ready." The Sovereign turned, its massive engines lighting the dark with a glow that would, 3 days later, register on a tired technician's sensors at a listening post on the very edge of a galaxy that had no idea what was coming. Behind it, the swarm kept moving, slow and patient, following the path the humans had once tried so hard to keep hidden, and far ahead, in council chambers and command centers across a dozen species who had spent a century assuming Earth was either dead or simply gone, nobody had the faintest idea that the silence was about to end, and that when it did, it would not end quietly. Vex Amara received Oven's report the next morning, along with 3 other reports from stations further along the ship's path. Every reading matched. Every reading confirmed the same impossible thing. Something enormous, something human, was moving through space that had been empty of human activity for a century, and it was not stopping to explain itself. She called an emergency session of the council that evening. The chamber filled quickly, faster than Vex had ever seen it fill for anything short of a declared war. Word had already spread, the way it always did, no matter how carefully a report was marked private. By the time she reached her seat at the head of the long table, every species with a voice in the Thessan Compact had a representative present, and every one of them looked uneasy in their own particular way. Councillor Braxa Toth of the Kelvic Union spoke first, as he usually did, because he disliked silence almost as much as he disliked being surprised. "Tell me this is a mistake," he said. "Tell me some old beacon malfunctioned and confused a patrol ship." "I wish I could," Vex said. 3 separate stations recorded the same contact. The mass reading is consistent. The signal matches an archived human warship signature. "This is not a malfunction." "Then what is it?" asked a smaller voice from further down the table. This was Ethal Sen, representative of the Corvain Assembly, a species that had traded more with humans than almost anyone else before the silence began. A relic? A drone left running on old orders? Humans have been gone for a century. Whatever built that ship, whoever crewed it, they cannot still be operating it after all this time. "We do not know that," Vex said. "We assumed a great many things about the humans, and most of what we assumed turned out to be built on very little evidence. We assumed they went quiet because something happened to them. We assumed they were weakened, or gone, or no longer capable of maintaining a modern fleet. Every one of those assumptions was built on the absence of information, not the presence of it." Braxa leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. So we have spent 100 years telling ourselves a comfortable story, and now the truth is arriving, whether we like it or not. That is one way to put it, Vex said. The council argued for hours. Some wanted to send a diplomatic envoy immediately, hoping to open contact before anything worse could happen. Others wanted to mobilize border defenses, treating the returning ship as a threat first, and asking questions only if it survived being challenged. A few, mostly younger counselors who had grown up hearing about humans only as historical curiosities, argued that the whole situation was being overblown, that one old warship, however large, could not possibly threaten a compact that spanned dozens of systems and hundreds of worlds. It was Ethal Sen who eventually said the thing that quieted the room. "You are all forgetting something," she said. "That ship is not just a mass reading. It is a message. Humans built machines that could speak louder than words, long before they had reason to say anything to us at all. If the Sovereign is moving toward settled space, and if it is not stopping to explain why, then whatever brought it out of hiding matters more than the ship itself. A species that spent 100 years in complete silence does not break that silence for nothing." Vex looked at her, with something close to gratitude. It was, she thought, the first useful thing said all evening. "She is right," Vex said. "We are not facing a threat from a single ship. We are facing an unknown. And unknowns are more dangerous than anything we can measure on a sensor screen." She stood, resting both hands on the table. "I propose we do 3 things. First, we increase readiness along every border station near the old human territory, quietly, without provoking anything. Second, we prepare a diplomatic channel, ready to open the moment we have any indication the ship is willing to communicate. Third, and this is the part I suspect will be least popular, we begin pulling every archive we have on humanity before the silence. Every trade record, every old alliance, every argument they ever had with us in this very chamber. If they are coming back, we had better remember exactly who we are dealing with." The vote passed, though not without more arguing over the details than Vex would have liked. By the time the session ended and the chamber emptied, night had fallen outside the compact's central station, and Vex remained behind, alone with the star chart once more. She thought about the first time she had ever spoken with a human representative, decades ago, back when she was young and new to council work, and humans still sat at this table, arguing about trade tariffs and border rights, like everyone else. She remembered them as loud, stubborn, quick to anger, and just as quick to laugh, utterly unwilling to back down from an argument, even when logic was clearly against them. She remembered thinking, at the time, that they were a strange, unpredictable little species, interesting, but never truly dangerous. She was no longer sure that second part had ever been true. The gray light on her star chart pulsed faintly now, matching the newest data feed from the border stations. Vex reached out and touched it, watching the readout update with the ship's projected course. It was heading, unmistakably, toward the heart of settled space, toward the old trade lanes, toward everyone who had spent 100 years assuming Earth's silence meant Earth no longer mattered. She had a feeling, one she could not quite explain, that the galaxy was about to learn how wrong that assumption had been. And somewhere far behind the approaching warship, unseen by any sensor station yet, the slow and patient swarm that had driven the Sovereign home was still coming, following the same path, carrying with it the answer to a question humanity had spent a century preparing for, and the rest of the galaxy had not even known to ask. The Ashwood Sovereign crossed the old border marker 7 days after Commander Elena Reyes gave the order to turn for home. There was no ceremony to mark the moment, no cheering crew, no announcement over the ship's speakers. Reyes simply watched the navigation display change one small icon from unclaimed space to compact border territory, and she felt something tighten in her chest that she had not expected to feel. For 100 years, no human ship had crossed that line. Now hers was the first, and she had no idea what was waiting on the other side. "Report," she said, without turning from the display. Lieutenant Marcus Webb checked his console. "Sensors are picking up increased activity. Looks like patrol ships, maybe 3 of them, holding position about 2 hours out at current speed. Non-human design, Kelvin Union markings, I think, based on the old recognition database. They see us?" "They see us, Commander. No question about that. We're not exactly small." Reyes allowed herself a small, tired smile. The Sovereign was 2 kilometers of hardened hull and layered armor, built to survive things that would erase a lesser ship without leaving debris. Stealth had never been part of its design philosophy. If anything, the opposite was true. The Sovereign had been built to be seen, to be a statement, a promise that whatever else happened to humanity, this was what they could build when they decided building it mattered more than anything else. "Any communication attempts?" she asked. "One hail, about 10 minutes ago. Standard compact greeting protocol, or what our archives think is standard. It's been 100 years, so who knows if it's changed. Answer it. Use the diplomatic protocol Ambassador Chen prepared before we left. Identify us, state our intentions as peaceful, and request permission to proceed toward human space." Webb's hands moved over the console, and a moment later, the Sovereign's answer went out across the old channels, the first official human transmission the galaxy had received in a century. The response, when it came, took nearly 20 minutes, longer than the light-speed delay alone could account for. Reyes suspected there had been a great deal of arguing on the other end before anyone decided what to say back. When the message finally arrived, it was short. It requested that the Sovereign hold position and await the arrival of a compact diplomatic vessel before proceeding any further into settled space. Reyes looked at the message for a long moment. Behind the Sovereign, somewhere in the dark she had left behind, the swarm was still coming, slow but steady, and every hour spent waiting was an hour the galaxy did not know what was following her home. "Helm," she said, "hold position as requested, but keep engines warm. If that swarm gets close enough to register on long range before the compact ship arrives, we are not going to sit here and wait politely." "Understood, Commander." 3 hours later, a compact vessel dropped out of transit space just ahead of the Sovereign. It was small by comparison, sleek and fast, built for diplomacy rather than war, painted in the pale blue colors that marked official Thessan compact vessels. Reyes had seen pictures of ships like it in the old archives, though the design had clearly changed in 100 years. Everything had changed in 100 years, she reminded herself. Everything except, apparently, the humans. "They're hailing us again," Webb said, requesting a video link this time. "Put it through." The main display flickered, and a face appeared. One Reyes did not recognize, but whose species she did, from old records. A Thessan, pale gray skin, elongated features, dark eyes that studied the camera with obvious curiosity, and equally obvious caution. "This is Ambassador Tel Korin, representing the Thessan Compact," the figure said. Its voice was translated through the ship's system, a half-second after the alien's mouth moved, close enough not to be jarring. "I am speaking with the commanding officer of the vessel, identified as human warship Ashwood Sovereign?" "That's correct," Reyes said. "Commander Alina Reyes, captain of the Sovereign, representing the human systems." There was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable. "Forgive my surprise, Commander. We were told this ship had been lost or decommissioned. We were told, in fact, that we might never hear from your people again. A lot of things were assumed about us over the last century, Ambassador. Most of them were wrong." Another pause. "I imagine there is a great deal to discuss. May I ask, first and most urgently, why your people have chosen this moment to break 100 years of silence? Our sensors detected your approach, but no explanation accompanied it." Reyes glanced at Webb, who nodded once, confirming what she already suspected. There was no gentle way to say this. "Ambassador, I am going to be direct, because I think the situation calls for it. 100 years ago, my people discovered evidence of a threat that we believed was capable of destroying entire civilizations. We chose to withdraw from galactic contact in order to prepare for the possibility that this threat might one day return. 3 months ago, that threat did return. My ship has spent the last several weeks observing a large hostile fleet moving out of deep space, on a course that will eventually bring it into contact with settled territory, including yours." The silence on the other end this time lasted much longer. "You are telling me," Tel Korin said finally, "that an unknown hostile force is following you home." "I am telling you exactly that." "And you chose to lead it directly toward compact space?" "I chose to warn you before it arrived, Ambassador, which is more than anyone gave us when they decided to leave us alone in the dark for 100 years, without asking whether we were still there." Reyes kept her voice level, but there was an edge in it now that she did not try to hide. My people spent a century preparing for this. We are not asking for your help. We are telling you what is coming, because it would be a poor way to return to the galaxy by letting an old ally walk into something blind. Telcorin's expression shifted, something between alarm and reassessment passing over the alien's face. I will need to relay this immediately to the Council. I would ask, Commander, that you accompany my vessel to the nearest compact station, so that a full report can be given directly. Time may be short, and second-hand information rarely serves well in matters this serious. Reyes considered it only briefly. Agreed. But my ship stays combat-ready the entire time. I am not putting my crew in a position where we cannot respond if that fleet arrives faster than expected. Understood, Commander. I would expect nothing less. The Sovereign followed the diplomatic vessel through compact space over the next 2 days, and Reyes watched, mostly in silence, as the scale of what humanity had missed became clear on every long-range sensor sweep. Trade routes busier than anything she remembered from old records. New stations, new colonies, entire systems developed in territory that had been empty wilderness the last time humans had any contact with the wider galaxy. 100 years was a long time for everyone, not just the species that had gone quiet. Marcus Webb spent most of those 2 days at the science station, cross-referencing what the Sovereign's sensors picked up against the old archives loaded into the ship's memory before departure. It's strange, he said, during one of the quieter stretches. Everything's changed, but it's still recognizable. Like coming home to a house where someone repainted every room, but left all the furniture where it used to be. Reyes gave a short laugh, the first real one she had allowed herself in weeks. That's one way to put it, Lieutenant. You think they'll believe us? About the fleet? Reyes considered the question seriously before answering. I think they'll believe the sensor data, eventually, once their own ships confirm it independently. Whether they believe we're telling the truth about our reasons, that's a different question. 100 years is long enough for people to decide we abandoned them for no good reason. Convincing them otherwise might take more than one honest conversation. And if they don't believe us? Then we defend ourselves, and everyone in range whether they believe us or not, and we let the results speak for themselves. That's what the Sovereign is for. The station they arrived at, 3 days after crossing the old border, was larger than anything Reyes had expected. A ring station, kilometers across, orbiting a quiet system that had clearly grown from a minor outpost into a major hub sometime in the last century. Hundreds of ships moved in and out of its docking arms, representing more species than Reyes could easily count from the bridge display alone. It was, in its own way, a beautiful sight, evidence of everything the galaxy had built while humanity sat in the dark, preparing for a war nobody else knew was coming. It was also, Reyes realized as her ship settled into a holding pattern near the station, going to be directly in the path of the swarm if it kept its current course and speed. Time until the fleet reaches this system, at current projections? She asked Webb quietly. He checked the numbers again, though she suspected he already knew the answer and had simply been putting off saying it out loud. Best estimate, assuming they don't accelerate, is 11 days. 11 days. Reyes looked out at the crowded station, at all the ships and lives and history that had grown up in the space humanity had left behind, and she understood, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her chest, that convincing the Council to believe her was no longer just important. It was the only thing standing between 11 peaceful days and whatever came after them. She opened a channel to the station. This is Commander Reyes of the Ashwood Sovereign, requesting immediate audience with the Compact Council. I have new information, and I do not think it can wait. The response came back almost instantly, faster than any of the earlier exchanges. Word, it seemed, had already traveled ahead of her. Commander, the Council is already assembling. They have been waiting for your arrival since your ship crossed into visual range. If you would proceed to Docking Bay 7, an escort will meet you. Reyes closed the channel and looked around the bridge at her crew, most of whom had grown up their entire lives inside human space, trained for a war they had never truly expected to fight, raised on stories about a galaxy none of them had ever seen with their own eyes until now. All right, she said. Let's go tell them the truth, and hope 100 years of silence hasn't made us too easy to disbelieve. The Sovereign's shuttle detached and made its way toward Docking Bay 7, carrying Reyes, Webb, and 2 other senior officers, toward a council chamber that had spent the last several days debating what to do about a ship, and was about to learn that the ship itself was the least of their problems. Behind them, far beyond the edge of any sensor station's reach, the swarm continued its slow and patient advance, and the 11 days Marcus Webb had calculated were already beginning to run out. The council chamber on the station was larger than the one Vex Amara had sat in a week earlier, built to hold representatives from every major species in the compact, rather than just the inner circle. When Reyes walked in, flanked by Webb and her 2 other officers, she felt the weight of every eye in the room. Dozens of species she recognized from old records, and a handful she did not recognize at all. Species that must have joined the compact sometime in the last 100 years, while humanity was not watching. Vex Amara sat near the center of the long curved table, and she rose slightly as Reyes approached, a gesture Reyes recognized from old diplomatic training as a mark of respect reserved for equals. "Commander Reyes," Vex said. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I understand you have urgent information." "I do," Reyes said. She did not sit, though a seat had been prepared for her. She preferred to stand while she spoke, the way she always briefed her own crew. "I'll give it to you plainly, because I don't think there's a version of this that sounds better dressed up." She laid it out the same way she had told Tel Korin, but in more detail this time. The ancient beacon, the century of preparation, the swarm, its size, its course, its speed, and the 11 days remaining before it reached this very system. She had Webb pull up the sovereign sensor logs on the chamber's main display, raw data alongside projected models, so the council could see the numbers for themselves, rather than simply take her word for it. When she finished, the chamber was silent for a long moment. Then, predictably, the arguing began. Braxatoth was first, as he had been in the earlier session, his voice carrying easily across the chamber. "You expect us to believe that a species who abandoned every treaty and every trade agreement it ever signed, without explanation, for a full century, is now returning only to warn us of a threat that conveniently only your ship has ever seen?" "I don't expect you to believe anything," Reyes said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I expect you to check the data. Send your own long-range sensors out along the course I've given you. You'll find the same thing my ship found, because it's real, whether you believe me personally or not." "And if we send ships out to look, and they find nothing?" Braxa pressed. "What then? Do we simply accept that humanity vanished for 100 years, for a reason that turned out to be imaginary?" "Then you'll have lost nothing but a few days of caution," Reyes said. "But if you don't look, and it turns out I'm telling the truth, you'll have lost considerably more than that." Ethal Sen, the Corvain representative Reyes did not yet know but who had argued in humanity's favor during the earlier session, spoke up before Braxa could respond further. "Commander, may I ask a different question? This ancient beacon, this evidence you found, do you have it? Can it be examined independently?" "A copy of the recovered data was brought with us," Reyes said. "My chief science officer can present the full findings, including the translation records, to any qualified analysts your council wishes to assign." "I would like that very much," Ithal said. "Because if this beacon exists, and if the translation is accurate, then this is not simply a matter of trusting your account, Commander. It becomes a matter of independent verification, which I believe would settle a great deal of doubt in this room, far more effectively than any amount of debate." Vex nodded slowly. "A reasonable proposal. Commander Reyes, would your people be willing to grant our scientists access to this data?" "Yes," Reyes said, without hesitation. "We didn't come here to hide anything, Counselor. We came here because 11 days from now, a fleet that erased an entire civilization is going to arrive in a system full of people who have no idea what's coming. Whatever doubts you have about us personally, I'd ask you to set them aside long enough to prepare, because there won't be time to argue about it once that fleet is in visual range." The chamber fell into a different kind of silence then, the sort that came not from disbelief, but from the slow, uncomfortable process of people beginning to accept something they very much did not want to accept. It was Vex who finally broke it. "Commander, I will be honest with you, because I think honesty is what this moment requires. There are those in this chamber who resent your people, quietly or otherwise, for the choice you made a century ago. Whatever your reasons, that silence cost us a great deal. Trade routes collapsed. Old alliances lost their anchor. An entire generation grew up believing humanity had either died or simply decided the rest of us were not worth the effort of a farewell. She paused. I say this not to attack you, but because I believe you deserve to understand the room you are standing in. You are not simply delivering a warning today. You are asking a galaxy that feels abandoned to trust the very people who abandoned it. Reyes was quiet for a moment before she answered. When she did, her voice was steadier, quieter, and somehow more forceful for it. Counselor, I wasn't alive when that decision was made. Neither was anyone on my crew. We inherited it, the same way you inherited the anger over it. I can't undo 100 years of silence, and I won't stand here and pretend the cost of it wasn't real. But I can tell you that every day of that silence was spent building something meant to protect people, not just ourselves. If that means something, then let it mean something now, when it matters most. If it doesn't, then defend yourselves however you see fit, and we'll defend what's ours. And I hope to every star in that chart that we don't have to find out the hard way whether that was enough. Nobody spoke for a long moment after that. Finally, Vex rose fully to her feet. I propose an immediate motion. First, that compact long-range scanning vessels be dispatched at once along the course provided by Commander Reyes, to independently verify the presence and movement of this fleet. Second, that our scientific council be granted full access to the beacon data brought by the Sovereign, with results to be reported within 48 hours. Third, and I do not say this lightly, that border defense forces along the affected systems be placed on heightened readiness immediately, regardless of the outcome of verification, given the extremely limited time available should the commander's account prove accurate. The vote, when it came, passed with far less argument than Reyes had expected, though she noticed Braxa Toth abstaining rather than voting in favor, his expression unreadable. As the chamber began to empty, Vex approached Reyes directly, away from the others. For what it's worth, Commander, I believe you. I have looked at that gray light on my star chart every day for years, and wondered what silence like that really meant. I do not think it meant what most of us assumed. Thank you, Counselor. Don't thank me yet, Vex said. 11 days is not very long, and I suspect the hardest arguments are still ahead of us, both in this chamber and out there, once people understand what is actually coming. She looked toward the chamber's viewport, where the crowded station and its countless ships glittered against the dark. I hope your people built well, Commander, during all that silence, because I have a feeling we are all about to find out exactly how well. Reyes followed her gaze out toward the stars, thinking of the Sovereign waiting in its holding pattern beyond the station, thinking of the century of quiet preparation that had led to this single crowded room, and thinking, most of all, of the swarm still moving steadily closer with every hour that passed. So do I, Counselor, she said quietly. So do I. 48 hours after the council session, the Compact's scientific team returned their findings on the beacon data, and the mood across the station changed almost overnight. The translation Commander Reyes had brought matched exactly what the human linguists had determined a century earlier. The ancient civilization the beacon had once belonged to was real. Its destruction was real. And the warning it carried, patient and unending, still held true after thousands of years of silence. They are still out there, and they are still hungry, and they will come again when there is enough to eat. Long-range compact scanning ships confirmed the second piece of the puzzle only a day later. The swarm was real too. Smaller vessels than expected, thousands of them, moving in a pattern too disciplined to be anything but a coordinated force, exactly where Reyes said it would be, exactly on the course she had predicted. By the time both confirmations reached the council, there was no more room for doubt, only the harder question of what to do about it. While the Compact scrambled to organize a response, Vex Amara found herself, more than once, thinking back to the stories she remembered about humans from decades earlier, trying to understand who these people really were beneath the century of silence. She requested, and was granted, permission to speak privately with Lieutenant Marcus Webb, whose grandparents, she learned, had lived through the earliest years of the withdrawal. They met in a small lounge near the docking bay, away from the noise of the council chambers. Webb looked tired, the kind of tired that came from being far from home in a room full of strangers who were not sure whether to trust you. Tell me, Vex said, once they had both settled with cups of something warm the station's kitchens produced for visiting dignitaries. What was it like, growing up the way you did? I confess I have very little idea what happened on the other side of that silence. Webb turned his cup slowly in his hands before answering. Honestly, counselor, most of us didn't think about it as strange, because it was all we knew. I grew up on a station orbiting Mars, and from the time I was old enough to understand anything, I understood that we were preparing for something. Not exactly what, not the details. That stuff was classified pretty tightly even for kids like me whose parents worked on it. But everyone knew the shape of it. Build ships. Train crews. Get ready. That sounds like a difficult way to grow up. It wasn't all bad, Webb said, with the faint trace of a smile. We still had schools, families, holidays, all the normal stuff. It wasn't like everyone walked around scared all the time. It was more like background noise. The way some people grow up near a coastline knowing there might be a big storm someday, and they build stronger houses because of it, but they still go to the beach on a nice day. He paused. My grandmother used to say the silence was the loneliest thing humanity ever chose to do to itself. She was part of the first generation, the ones who remembered what it was like before, trading with other species, arguing in council chambers just like this one. She told me once that giving that up was harder than almost anything else in the whole plan. Harder than the building, harder than the training. Just not talking to anyone else out there anymore, not knowing what was happening in the rest of the galaxy, wondering if anyone even remembered we existed. Vex was quiet for a moment. We did remember, she said. Not always kindly, I admit. There was resentment, especially early on, when the silence first began and people assumed the worst reasons for it. But we remembered. I think that would have meant something to her, Webb said. She passed before any of this happened. Never got to see if it was worth it. Do you think it was? Webb considered the question seriously. I think we're about to find out, counselor. That's the honest answer. 100 years of preparation doesn't mean anything until you actually have to use what you prepared. We've got ships. We've got weapons we've never fired outside of testing. We've got training that's never been tested against something that could actually kill us in large numbers. All of that is theory, until the moment it isn't. He looked up at her. I hope it was worth it. I really do. But hope isn't the same as knowing. Their conversation was interrupted by a priority message on Webb's personal comm, and his expression shifted the moment he read it. Commander Reyes wants me back on the Sovereign, he said, standing quickly. Compact Command has authorized direct communication with Earth. First contact in 100 years, going out within the hour. Vex stood as well. May I observe? Webb hesitated only briefly. I don't see why not, counselor. Given everything, I think you've earned that much. They made their way back to the Sovereign together, and Vex found herself standing on a human warship's bridge for the first time in her long life, surrounded by technology that felt both familiar and strange, built along principles she half recognized from a century-old design, but refined in ways she could not fully follow. Commander Reyes stood at the center of the bridge, watching a countdown on the main display. Long-range relay is set, she said. Signal will take a few hours to reach Earth, even at maximum transmission strength, given the distance. We won't get a response until sometime tomorrow at the earliest. What will you tell them? Vex asked. Reyes glanced at her, seeming to weigh how much to share with a compact counselor standing on her bridge, before apparently deciding it did not matter much anymore. The truth. The fleet is real. It's closer than anyone hoped it would ever get in our lifetimes. We're going to need everything Earth has, and we're going to need it faster than anyone planned for. Do you believe your people are ready? Reyes considered the question for longer than Vex expected. I believe we built the best we knew how to build, with 100 years and limited resources, and a threat we only understood from fragments of an ancient warning. Whether that's enough, I honestly don't know. But I know we're not walking into this blind, and I know we're not walking into it alone anymore. Not if the Compact is willing to stand with us. The Council has authorized full mobilization of border defense forces, Vex said. It was not an easy vote. There are still those who believe this is somehow a trick, or an exaggeration, despite everything the scans have confirmed. But enough of us understand what is at stake. You will have support, Commander. Whatever else stands between our peoples, I do not believe any of us want to find out what that swarm does to an undefended system. Reyes nodded slowly. Then I suppose it's time to see exactly what 100 years of silence was worth, on both sides of it. The signal reached Earth 31 hours later. according to the transmission logs Webb monitored personally, refusing to leave his post, even when his shift technically ended. When the response finally came, it arrived not as a simple message but as a flood of encrypted traffic, more data than the Sovereign's relay could process at once, forcing Webb to prioritize which channels to open first. The first clear transmission that made it through was a video message, and when it resolved on the bridge's main display, Reyes stood a little straighter, and Vex noticed the shift immediately. The man on the screen wore a uniform Vex did not recognize, though its authority was unmistakable from the way every human on the bridge reacted to his presence. He was older, gray-haired, with the kind of tired, steady expression that Vex had come to associate with people who had spent a long time carrying weight they could not set down. "Commander Reyes," he said, "this is Fleet Admiral Daniel Osei, speaking from Earth Command. We have received your reports, and independently confirmed the fleet's presence and trajectory, using deep space arrays we've maintained since the beginning of the withdrawal. I want you to know, before anything else, that your service over these past years has not gone unnoticed, and what you've done in the last several weeks may be the single most important thing any human has accomplished since we chose this path a century ago." He paused, and something in his expression shifted, gathering itself for what came next. Effective immediately, Earth Defense Command is initiating full mobilization. Every reserve fleet, every home defense platform, every ship we have built and tested over the last 100 years is being brought to readiness. We are not going to fight this alone if the Compact is willing to stand with us, but we are also not going to assume that help will arrive in time, or at all. We prepared for 100 years for exactly this possibility, and now we are going to find out whether that preparation means what we hoped it would. He looked directly into the camera, and though Vex knew it was simply the nature of a recorded transmission, it felt, for a moment, as though he were looking directly at her as well. To our neighbors in the Compact and beyond, watching this message through allied channels, we know 100 years of silence has cost trust that will not be easily rebuilt. We do not ask you to forget that. We ask only that you let us stand beside you now, because whatever comes next, it is going to take more than any one of us alone to survive it. Earth is done being silent. We are coming, and we are bringing everything we have. The transmission ended, and for a long moment nobody on the bridge spoke. Millions of light-years of cable and relay stations away, on Earth itself, the message that started as a quiet warning had already become the loudest thing to happen to the planet in 100 years. In the shipyards above Mars, where 3 generations of engineers had built and rebuilt the fleet that now waited in low orbit, alarms sounded through every corridor at once, calling every off-duty worker back to their stations. A woman named Priya Nathan, chief engineer on the dry dock platform that housed the newest class of human cruiser, had been asleep for less than 4 hours when the call came through. She was on the floor of the shipyard within 20 minutes, still pulling on her uniform jacket, shouting orders to crews who had trained for exactly this moment for years, without ever truly believing it would come. "Full systems check on every hull and dock," she called out, her voice carrying across the vast open space of the yard, where half-finished ships hung suspended in scaffolding under construction lights that never dimmed. "I want power cores online within the hour. Anything not flight-ready gets flagged immediately. I don't care how far along it is. We move what we can move, and we finish what we can finish, and we do both at the same time." Around her, workers who had spent years assembling ships piece by piece under peacetime schedules suddenly found themselves working against a countdown that felt, for the first time, entirely real. Priya's own grandfather had helped design the very first prototype hull that eventually became the template for the Ashwood Sovereign, back before she was born, back when the silence was still new, and nobody knew if the sacrifice would ever mean anything. She thought of him now, gone many years, and wondered what he would have said if he could see this moment, the moment his life's work was finally about to be tested. Across the system, on training stations orbiting Earth itself, young recruits who had spent years drilling in simulators were suddenly told that their next deployment would not be a drill at all. A recruit named Diego Alvarez, barely 2 years out of the academy, stood in the crowded briefing hall, listening to his commanding officer explain, in careful, measured words, that the swarm the entire fleet had trained against in theoretical models for a century was now an hour-by-hour reality, closing distance toward a system that was not their own, but that Earth had chosen to stand beside anyway. Some of you are going to ask why we're sending help to people who barely remember we exist, the officer said, pacing in front of the assembled recruits. I'll tell you why. Because 100 years ago, our ancestors decided that if this day ever came, we would not let anyone else face it the way we were prepared to face it, alone and unwarned. That promise didn't come with conditions. It didn't say we'd only help people who liked us, or people who understood why we went quiet. It said we'd help, full stop, because that's what having power without using it for something worthwhile really means. He looked out at the recruits, some of them barely older than Diego, faces caught somewhere between fear and something that looked almost like pride. You've trained for this. All of you. Whether you believed it would really happen or not, you trained for it. Today we find out if that training was enough. Diego felt his hands shaking slightly as he checked his gear that evening, the same gear he had checked 1,000 times in simulations that never carried any real weight. This time, when he ran through the checklist, every item felt different, heavier, more permanent. He thought about his mother, who had been a child during the earliest years of the silence, who used to tell him stories about how strange it felt growing up, not knowing what the stars beyond their own system actually held. He wondered if she was watching the news feeds right now, back home, understanding for the first time exactly what all those years of quiet preparation had actually been for. Across every human-occupied system, similar scenes repeated in 1,000 variations. Reservists called back to active duty, left half-finished dinners on tables, and hurried children off to relatives before reporting to their assigned stations. Civilian shipping companies rerouted cargo runs to make room for military transports moving supplies toward the front. Schools held assemblies where teachers, doing their best to sound calm, explained to students too young to fully understand what mobilization meant, that their planet was, for the first time in living memory, no longer alone in facing whatever came next. Fleet Admiral Osei watched most of this unfold from Earth Defense Command, a vast underground facility built decades earlier specifically for a moment like this one, its walls lined with displays tracking every ship, every station, every unit moving into position across 100 years of careful, patient planning, now compressed into a matter of days. He had commanded this fleet in exercises 100 times over the years, had run every simulation his staff could devise, had spent sleepless nights wondering whether any of it would matter if the day ever actually came. Now that it had come, he found himself surprisingly calm, the nervous energy of the last several hours settling into something steadier, something closer to resolve. He thought of the message he had just sent to the Sovereign, to the Compact, to a galaxy that had spent a century assuming humanity no longer mattered, and he hoped, quietly, that the promise in those words would hold up against everything still to come. "Status report," he said to the officer beside him, without looking away from the main display. 70% of reserve fleet at readiness, sir, with full readiness projected within 6 days. Home defense platforms are already active. Compact liaison confirms border forces are mobilizing on their end as well. And the timeline? Current projections give us 9 days before contact, sir. Maybe less if the swarm accelerates. Osei nodded slowly, studying the display, watching the small icons representing ships and stations shift into new formations across the star map. 100 years of quiet, patient building, finally converging toward the moment it had all been for. Then we have 9 days to become everything we spent 100 years preparing to be, he said. Let's not waste a single hour of it. Vex looked at the star chart display near the command station, where the light that had once been simply gray now pulsed steadily, brightly, unmistakably alive. Behind that light, according to the latest tracking data scrolling continuously along the edge of the screen, the swarm had closed the distance further still. 9 days remained, according to the newest projections, and every one of those days would now be spent in the fastest, most desperate mobilization either species had ever attempted. Reyes finally broke the silence, turning to her crew, with the same steady voice she had used in every difficult moment since the swarm first appeared on her sensors. You heard the Admiral. Full readiness, all stations. We're not just defending a fleet anymore. We're defending everything 100 years of silence was meant to protect. She looked toward the viewport, toward the crowded station and the systems beyond it, home to species who had spent that same century building lives the swarm knew nothing about, and would not spare if given the chance. Let's get to work, she said, We don't have much time left to waste. Behind her, the star chart's light pulsed on. Steady now. No longer gray. No longer silent. Counting down the last few days, before everything humanity had built in secret would finally be tested against the very thing it had been built to face. The 9 days passed faster than anyone at Earth Defense Command would have liked, and slower than anyone waiting on the front line thought possible. By the 7th day, the combined human and compact fleet had gathered at the edge of the system the swarm was projected to reach first, a quiet trade hub called Farron's Rest, home to nearly 2 million people, across a handful of orbital stations and one modest colony world. It was not the largest system in the compact, nor the most strategically important, but it was the first thing standing between the swarm and everything beyond it, and that made it the line where the fight would happen, whether anyone liked the odds or not. Commander Reyes stood on the Sovereign's bridge, watching the assembled fleet spread across the main display. Human ships, newly arrived from the shipyards and training stations, formed the inner defensive ring closest to the colony world. Compact ships, gathered from a dozen member species, held position further out, a patchwork of designs and colors that Reyes found, despite everything, oddly reassuring. 100 years of silence had not stopped either side from learning, in the space of 9 frantic days, how to coordinate well enough to stand together. Final positions confirmed, Webb reported from his station. Everyone's where they're supposed to be. Compact Command has authorized joint tactical control, coordinated through our systems, since we have the most direct experience with the enemy's likely tactics. Any word from the swarm? Reyes asked. Communication attempts? Anything at all? Nothing, Commander. Same as before. No response to any hail on any frequency we've tried. Either they can't communicate the way we understand it, or they don't see any reason to. Reyes had expected that answer, but hearing it confirmed still settled uneasily in her chest. An enemy that could be reasoned with was dangerous. An enemy that simply did not register the concept of reasoning at all was something else entirely. Vex Amara, who had insisted on remaining aboard the Sovereign for the battle, despite the objections of several fellow counselors, stood near the back of the bridge, watching the preparations, with an expression Reyes had come to recognize over the past 9 days, as quiet, careful attention. How much longer? Vex asked. Sensors put them at just under 2 hours out, still holding the same course and speed they've kept the entire time we've been tracking them, Reyes said. No sign they know we're waiting, though I'd be surprised if something that size can't detect a fleet this large sitting directly in its path. Perhaps they simply don't care, Vex said quietly. Reyes did not have a good answer for that. The 2 hours passed in the particular kind of silence that settles over any group of people waiting for something they cannot stop and cannot fully prepare for, no matter how much preparation has already happened. Crews ran final checks on weapons and shields. Officers reviewed tactical plans one more time, even though every plan had already been reviewed a dozen times over the preceding days. On the colony world below, evacuation shuttles carried the last of Farron's Rest's civilian population toward transports, waiting to jump them to safety, further inside compact territory. A process that had begun the moment the timeline became clear, and was only now, in the final hour, finishing. When the swarm finally appeared on long-range sensors, it did not look, at first, like the terrifying thing everyone had spent 9 days preparing for. It looked like a haze, a faint smear of motion at the very edge of detection range. Thousands of individual signatures blurred together by distance into something that resembled weather more than an armada. That impression did not last. As the range closed, the haze resolved into individual ships, and the sheer number of them became impossible to ignore. Reyes had seen the sensor data a dozen times over the past weeks, had briefed her own crew on the scale of what was coming, and still found herself gripping the edge of her command console a little tighter as the true size of the swarm became clear on the main display. All ships, weapons free the moment they enter engagement range, she said, her voice carrying across the ship's comm to every station. Coordinate fire patterns as briefed. Compact fleet, hold formation on the outer ring and cover our flanks. Let's see what 100 years bought us. The swarm entered engagement range without slowing, without any sign of hesitation or strategy beyond simple, relentless advance, and the battle began. It was unlike anything Marcus Webb had trained for in any simulation, not because the tactics were unfamiliar, but because the sheer scale of the enemy, made every simulation feel, in hindsight, absurdly small. The swarm's individual ships were not powerful on their own, weaker even than older compact patrol craft, but there were so many of them that the human and compact fleets found themselves fighting not a battle of skill and precision, but a battle of attrition. Every gun crew working as fast as they could, simply to keep pace with the sheer number of targets pouring toward them. The Sovereign's main batteries, built and refined over 100 years specifically for a threat like this, tore through wave after wave of the smaller ships, each shot accounting for dozens of enemy vessels at once, thanks to weapon systems designed from the start to handle overwhelming numbers rather than single powerful targets. Reyes watched the tactical display update in real time, watched the swarm's numbers fall steadily, even as more of it kept coming, and felt, for the first time since this had all begun, a cautious flicker of something like hope. Enemy losses at approximately 30% and climbing, Webb reported, his voice tight with concentration as he tracked the battle's shifting numbers. Our losses are minimal so far. The compact ships are holding the outer ring well, better than I expected, honestly. Don't get comfortable, Reyes said. 30% losses, and they haven't slowed down or changed tactics at all. Whatever's driving that swarm, it's not worried about casualties the way we are. She was right to be cautious. An hour into the battle, as the human and compact fleets began to believe, cautiously, that the tide was turning in their favor, the swarm's behavior changed for the first time since anyone had begun tracking it. A portion of the remaining ships, perhaps a third of what was left, broke formation entirely, diving past the defensive line in a coordinated maneuver that no simple, mindless swarm should have been capable of executing. They're bypassing the fleet, Webb said, alarm sharp in his voice. Heading straight for the colony world, evacuation status. 90% complete as of the last report, Reyes finished grimly. That leaves 200,000 people still down there. Reyes did not hesitate. Sovereign, come about. Full power to the engines. We're not letting them reach that colony. The massive ship turned with a speed that should have been impossible for something its size. Engines built and tested over 100 years, finally proving their worth in exactly the moment they were designed for. The Sovereign cut across the battle at an angle no smaller ship could have managed, putting itself directly between the breakaway swarm ships and the colony world below. What followed was not a battle so much as a demonstration of exactly what a century of quiet, patient preparation had been building toward. The Sovereign's point defense systems, designed specifically to handle exactly this kind of overwhelming small ship assault, opened fire in a pattern too fast and too precise for any human gunner to manage alone, guided instead by targeting computers refined over generations for this single purpose. Enemy ships fell by the dozens, then the hundreds, caught in a wall of fire that seemed, for a few desperate minutes, almost too fast to be real. It was not enough on its own. Even the Sovereign's overwhelming firepower could not stop every ship in the breakaway group, and a handful slipped through toward the colony's outer defense platforms, close enough that Reyes watched, helpless for a moment, as the display showed impacts registering against the last of the evacuation convoy still holding position near the planet. Then the compact fleet's outer ring, which had been holding its position exactly as briefed, broke formation on its own initiative, a squadron of Kelvik and Corvain ships peeling away to intercept the remaining breakaway swarm before it could do further damage. Reyes had not ordered the maneuver. Nobody had. It happened because officers on those ships, watching the same display everyone else was watching, made the same choice at nearly the same moment, understanding, without being told, that some things did not require a direct order to be the obviously right thing to do. The breakaway group was destroyed within minutes of the compact ship's intervention, the last of the evacuation convoy escaping into transit space with damage but no casualties, according to the frantic reports flooding in from the colony world below. Back at the main engagement, the remaining bulk of the swarm continued its relentless advance against the combined fleet, and though the human and compact ships were winning, slowly, grinding the swarm down ship by ship, Reyes could see on the tactical display that the cost was mounting. 3 compact vessels lost, 2 human cruisers damaged badly enough to withdraw from the fight entirely. The battle that had started with cautious hope had become, in the space of 2 hours, a brutal, exhausting fight for every inch of space around Farron's Rest. It was Vex, still standing near the back of the bridge, who noticed something the tactical computers had not yet flagged. Commander, she said, her voice carrying an urgency Reyes had not heard from her before. Look at the pattern of their advance. They are not simply attacking randomly. Watch the ships that survive longest. They are converging, slowly, on something specific. Reyes followed her gaze to the display, and after a moment, she saw it too. The swarm's remaining ships, despite heavy losses, were angling their approach in a way that, when projected forward, led directly toward the Sovereign itself, rather than spreading evenly across the defensive line the way a true random assault would. They're targeting us specifically, Reyes said slowly. Why would they target one ship out of an entire fleet? Webb's hands moved rapidly across his console, cross-referencing the swarm's behavior against every model the ship's computers had built over the course of the battle. When he looked up, his expression had gone pale. Commander, I think it's the beacon. The Sovereign carried a working copy of the beacon data the entire time we've been out here. If that data is somehow more than just a recording, if it's some kind of signal they can detect, then we've been broadcasting exactly where to find us this whole time, Reyes finished. She did not waste time second-guessing the theory. There was no time left to waste on anything. Purge the beacon data from active systems immediately. Isolate it completely if you can't wipe it. Working on it now, Commander. But even if that's the answer, it might not matter. They're already locked onto our position. Cutting the signal now might not change their current course. Reyes looked out at the battle raging around her ship, at the swarm's remaining vessels converging steadily closer, despite everything the combined fleet was doing to stop them, and she made the only decision that made sense in the moment. Then we give them exactly what they're looking for, she said. All ships, converge on the Sovereign's position. If they want us, let's make them pay for every inch of the way. The final phase of the battle for Farron's Rest began the moment the order went out, and every ship still capable of moving turned toward the Sovereign's position at once. Among the ships answering the call was the newly commissioned cruiser Meridian, one of the last vessels to leave the Mars shipyards before the swarm's arrival, rushed into service so quickly that half its systems had barely finished calibration testing. Priya Nathan, the chief engineer who had overseen its final construction, had insisted on riding aboard for its first deployment, unwilling to send a ship she had built with her own hands into battle, without seeing for herself whether it held together the way the models promised. She stood now in the Meridian's engine room, monitoring power flow to the shields as the ship pushed toward maximum speed, and felt the whole vessel shudder under the strain of systems being tested for the first time, under real combat conditions, rather than simulation. Shields at 90% and holding, she called out to the bridge over the comm. She's not going to let you down, Captain. Just don't ask her for more than she's got left in her. Noted, Chief, came the reply. Hold on to something. This is about to get rough. Diego Alvarez, the young recruit who had checked his gear with shaking hands 9 days earlier, found himself at a point defense station aboard one of the older cruisers now converging alongside the Meridian, his hands steady now, in a way they had not been during that first anxious evening, steadied by hours of continuous fighting that left no room left for fear, only for the next target, and the one after that. He had lost count of how many enemy ships his station alone had destroyed over the course of the battle. He had also watched, from the corner of his display, as 2 ships from his own training class had been lost in the fighting, names he had known personally, faces he would not see again. There was no time to grieve that now. There would be time later, if there was a later at all. Multiple contacts converging on the Sovereign's flank. He called out as his sensors updated. I've got a clear firing line. Engaging now. The battle around the Sovereign became, in its final stretch, the most intense fighting anyone present had ever experienced. The swarm's remaining ships, whatever drove their strange, focused determination, threw themselves at the Sovereign and the growing wall of Allied vessels protecting it, with a single-minded persistence that ignored their own mounting losses entirely. Reyes watched wave after wave break against her ship's defenses, watched the combined fleet grind the swarm down ship by ship even as damage reports from her own vessel began climbing. Shields down to 60%, Webb reported, his voice tight but controlled. Starboard batteries are overheating faster than they can cool. We're holding, Commander, but we're not going to hold forever at this rate. How many of them are left? Maybe 200, converging from 3 angles. It's not the whole swarm anymore, just what broke off and locked onto us specifically. 200 ships. It was a fraction of what the swarm had started with, but pressed entirely against a handful of vessels, rather than spread across an entire defensive line. It was still an overwhelming number, and Reyes knew her ship alone could not withstand it much longer. It was Vex who spoke next, still standing near the back of the bridge, her voice carrying an idea, rather than simply an observation this time. "Commander, if the beacon signal is truly what draws them, and if purging it from your systems has not changed their course, because they are already locked onto your position, then perhaps the solution is not to hide the signal, but to move it." Reyes turned to look at her. "Explain." "Load the beacon data onto an unmanned shuttle. Launch it away from the fleet, deep into open space, away from every inhabited system. If the swarm's remaining ships are truly following that signal above all else, they may follow the shuttle, instead of continuing to converge on your ship and the fleet protecting it." Reyes considered it for only a moment before turning to Webb. "Can we do it? We've got 2 evacuation shuttles still docked, unused since the colony finished its evacuation early. I can strip the guidance systems and load the beacon data in under 5 minutes, but Commander, once that shuttle launches, we have no way of knowing for certain the swarm will actually follow it instead of us." "We don't have a better option," Reyes said. "Do it. Launch it on a course, straight out of the system, away from every populated world in range." 5 tense minutes later, the modified shuttle launched from the Sovereign's forward bay, its systems stripped down to nothing but the beacon data, and enough basic guidance to carry it on a long, straight course into open space. For a moment, nothing happened, and Reyes watched the tactical display with the specific kind of stillness that came from waiting on a gamble, with no way to influence the outcome further. Then, one by one, the swarm's remaining ships began to change course. It started with a handful of vessels on the outer edge of the converging formation, breaking away from their approach on the Sovereign to chase the shuttle's slow, steady path into the dark. Within a minute, the pattern spread through the rest of the group, ship after ship, abandoning its focus on the fleet to follow the retreating signal instead, until the entire remaining swarm had turned away from the battle entirely, pursuing a decoy carrying nothing more dangerous than old data and empty cargo space. "They're all going after it," Webb said, disbelief clear in his voice, even as relief flooded through the rest of his report. "Every last one of them. They're leaving the system." Reyes allowed herself a long, slow breath, the first real moment of relief she had felt since the battle began. "Counselor," she said, turning to Vex, "that idea may have just saved this entire fleet." "I only offered the thought, Commander," Vex said, though there was something in her expression, quiet pride mixed with lingering disbelief at how close the moment had come, that suggested she understood exactly how much that thought had mattered. "Your people built the ship fast enough to act on it." Across the system, the remaining swarm ships shrank steadily on every long-range sensor, chasing a decoy deeper and deeper into empty space, farther from Farron's rest with every passing minute. It would take hours, perhaps longer, before anyone could be certain the trick had worked completely, before fleet scanners confirmed no stragglers had broken off to try their luck against the defended system after all. But for the first time since the battle began, the tactical display showed something that had not been true in hours. No enemy vessels advancing on the fleet, no immediate threat closing the distance, only the slow, retreating tail of a swarm, following a decoy toward the empty dark. The cost of the victory settled in slowly, as damage reports continued to arrive. 5 compact ships lost, along with 2 human cruisers destroyed outright and 3 more badly damaged, including, Reyes learned with a tightness in her chest, one of the training class ships that had carried recruits like Diego Alvarez into their very first engagement. Diego himself had survived, along with most of his crew, though the ship beside his had not been so fortunate. Reyes stood on the Sovereign's bridge as the last of the battle reports came in, looking out at the scarred but victorious fleet still holding position around Farron's Rest, at the colony world below where evacuation ships were already beginning the slow process of returning civilians to their homes. It was a victory, undeniably, but it was not the end, not even close, and everyone on that bridge understood it. "That was one arm of the swarm," Reyes said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "One piece that broke off and came this far ahead of the rest. There's still a much larger force out there, somewhere behind where this one came from, and we've just shown them exactly what it takes to beat a piece of it." Vex stepped up beside her, looking out at the same scarred, victorious fleet. "Then I suppose the question, Commander, is what the rest of that swarm does, now that its scouts have failed to return." Reyes did not have an answer for that, not yet. But as she looked out at the fleet she and the Compact had built together in 9 desperate days, human ships and alien ships, holding formation side by side, after a battle neither side could have won alone, she found herself believing, for the first time since the silence first ended, that whatever came next, they would not be facing it unprepared, and they would not be facing it alone. 3 weeks after the battle at Farron's Rest, the full scale of what humanity and the Compact were truly facing became clear, and it was larger, far larger, than anyone had allowed themselves to fear out loud. Long-range scouts, human and Compact ships working together now as a matter of routine rather than exception, pushed deep into the region, beyond the old human border, following the path the swarm's scattered remnant had originally come from. What they found, relayed back to Earth and to the Compact Council in careful, methodical reports over the following days, was not simply a larger fleet. It was a staging ground, an enormous cluster of construction and gathering vessels spread across 3 uninhabited systems, evidence of a force that had been building for a very long time, patient, in exactly the way the ancient beacon's warning had promised. The single arm that attacked Farron's Rest, the fleet that had taken 9 days of frantic mobilization and cost dozens of ships to defeat, had been a fraction of the whole. A scouting party, in the truest sense, sent ahead to test the resistance it would find, and perhaps, to draw out exactly the kind of information the beacon signal had apparently been designed to attract. Fleet Admiral Osei presented these findings personally to a joint session of Earth's government and the full Compact Council, held for the first time, not across a communication delay of light years, but in person, aboard a newly constructed neutral station, built specifically for the occasion, positioned along the old human border, where the 2 territories now met, without the wall of silence that had separated them for a century. The threat we faced at Farron's Rest was real, and the victory there was real, Osei said, standing before the largest gathering of species the chamber had ever hosted. But I want to be honest about what our scouts have found since. What we fought was not the war. It was the opening move. The main force, based on everything we've observed, numbers in the tens of thousands of vessels, possibly more, and shows every sign of continued, patient growth, rather than any immediate advance. A murmur passed through the chamber, and Vexamara, seated now not as a lone voice pushing for caution, but as one representative among many who had come to understand exactly what was at stake, rose to address the room. "Then we have time," she said. "Not unlimited time, but time nonetheless, if the enemy is building rather than advancing. Time we did not have 9 days before Farron's Rest, and time we should not waste arguing over old grievances, while a war of true scale sits waiting on our doorstep." Commander Reyes, seated near the front of the human delegation, watched the chamber's mood shift slowly from the raw fear of the past weeks toward something steadier, something closer to resolve. It reminded her, in an odd way, of the stories her own instructors had told about the earliest years of the silence, when humanity first understood the scale of what it was preparing for, and had to decide, as a species, whether that preparation was worth everything it would cost. "With respect, Counselor," said Braxatoth, still skeptical even now, though his tone carried less hostility than it once had. "Time to prepare is only useful if we know what we are preparing for. The humans spent a century readying themselves based on fragments of an ancient warning. What do we actually know about this enemy, beyond the fact that it exists, and that it is patient?" "Very little, still," Osei admitted. "Our scouts have not risked direct contact beyond the minimum necessary to confirm the scale of the staging ground. What we do know is this. The beacon's warning described a force that consumes rather than conquers, that moves against a region only once it has grown sufficiently in that region to be worth the effort. If that pattern holds, then the swarm we fought at Farron's Rest may have been sent not simply to scout our defenses, but to determine whether this stretch of the galaxy had grown valuable enough yet to justify a larger campaign. And having failed, having lost that scouting force entirely, Ithal Sen said slowly, working through the implication as she spoke it aloud, what happens next? Does it retreat, reassess, or does a failed scout simply confirm that the resistance here is strong enough to warrant sending more? Nobody in the chamber had a certain answer to that question, and the uncertainty hung over the room heavier than any argument that had come before it. It was Vex who finally spoke into that silence, her voice carrying the particular calm of someone who had spent weeks watching a gray light on a star chart slowly come back to life, and had decided, somewhere along the way, that she would not let it go dark again without a fight. "Then we prepare for either outcome," she said. "We do not know if this enemy retreats from strength or simply grows more determined by it. What we do know is that facing it divided, the way we have faced every threat throughout our history, as separate species, scattered across separate systems, gave that first scouting force every advantage it needed to nearly overwhelm us in a single system, in a single afternoon. We survived because two peoples who had 100 years of silence and mistrust between them chose, in the space of 9 days, to stand together anyway." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of representative after representative, species after species. "I propose we do not wait for the next attack to decide whether that choice was worth making permanent. I propose a formal alliance, human and compact both, built specifically to face whatever comes from beyond that staging ground, with shared resources, shared intelligence, and shared command structures, so that the next time we are tested, we are not improvising our cooperation in the middle of a battle we cannot afford to lose." The debate that followed lasted the better part of 2 days, filled with exactly the kind of arguing Vex had expected and, in some strange way, had come to find reassuring, because it meant the galaxy still cared enough about its own future to fight over how best to protect it. In the end, the alliance passed, not unanimously, but with enough support from enough species that its authority was unquestionable, backed by both the Compact's vast and varied fleets and the 100 years of quiet, purposeful preparation that Earth had poured into ships like the Sovereign. Commander Reyes was given command of the Alliance's first joint task force, a position she accepted with the same steady, unshowy resolve she had carried through every moment since the swarm first appeared on her sensors months earlier. Marcus Webb was promoted to serve as her chief liaison officer, spending as much time now in compact council chambers, learning the shape of a galaxy he had only recently discovered, as he did aboard the Sovereign itself. Vex Amara, for her part, took on a role that did not exist a year earlier, something between diplomat and historian, tasked with ensuring that the Alliance never again let 100 years of silence grow between allies who could not afford, this time, to lose track of each other. In the months that followed the Alliance's founding, life did not simply return to normal, because normal, for both humans and the Compact, no longer meant what it once had. But something steadier did take hold, a new rhythm, built from shared purpose rather than old habit. On Mars, Priya Nathan found herself promoted to oversee an entirely new joint shipyard project, one where human engineers worked side by side with Compact designers, for the first time in a century, combining 100 years of separate innovation into ships neither side could have built alone. She kept a small photograph of her grandfather's original prototype hull pinned above her workstation, a reminder of how far that first sketch had traveled to reach this moment. On the day the joint yard launched its first fully collaborative vessel, a mid-sized cruiser built from both human armor plating and compact shield technology, she stood on the observation deck and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply enjoy watching something she had built fly. Diego Alvarez, promoted twice in the months since Farron's rest, transferred to the new Joint Training Academy, established at the Neutral Border Station, where human and compact recruits now trained together under a shared curriculum, built from lessons both sides had learned the hard way. He found himself, more often than he expected, telling stories about the battle to wide-eyed recruits who had been too young to fully understand the danger when it happened, watching them absorb the same mixture of fear and resolve he remembered feeling in that crowded briefing hall 9 days before his first real fight. He did not tell them it would be easy. He told them, instead, exactly what his own commanding officer had told him, that training was only theory until the moment it wasn't, and that the only way to know if it had been enough was to have already done the work beforehand, because there would be no time to do it once the moment arrived. Vex Amara spent those months traveling more than she had in decades, moving between compact worlds and human systems both, working to build the practical structures that would let the Alliance function smoothly rather than simply exist on paper. She visited Earth itself for the first time near the end of that period, standing on a hillside overlooking one of the planet's oldest cities, and found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of the story Marcus Webb had told her about his grandmother, about the loneliness of choosing silence without knowing if it would ever be understood. She stood there a long while, watching the sun set over a world that had spent 100 years quietly preparing for a war nobody else had known was coming, and she thought that if his grandmother could somehow see this moment, see her grandson serving as liaison to an alliance spanning dozens of species, see the silence not just ended, but transformed into something stronger than the trade agreements and casual visits that had existed before it, she thought perhaps it might, finally, feel like it had been worth it after all. The alliance was not without its difficulties. Old resentments did not vanish simply because a common enemy had appeared. Some compact worlds remained wary of human intentions, quietly suspicious that a century of secret shipbuilding suggested ambitions beyond simple self-defense. Some humans, in turn, resented the demands the alliance placed on resources and lives that had already given so much during the long years of preparation, questioning why a species that had ignored them for 100 years now deserved an equal share of the sacrifice required to protect everyone. Vex spent as much time managing these quiet tensions as she did managing the larger, more visible work of coordinating fleets and intelligence, and she came to understand that the war they were truly fighting was not only against whatever waited beyond the staging ground, but also against the easy temptation to let old fears and old grudges undo everything 9 desperate days at Farron's Rest had managed to build. 6 months after the battle at Farron's Rest, the Sovereign led a combined fleet on its first deep patrol beyond the old staging ground, a joint force of human and compact ships flying in formation that would have seemed impossible a year before, when the galaxy still believed Earth had either died or simply stopped caring about anyone beyond its own quiet borders. Standing on the bridge, watching the stars slide past on the main display, Reyes found herself thinking again of her grandmother's stories, of the loneliness that had defined the earliest years of the silence, the uncertainty of not knowing if the sacrifice would ever be understood, let alone appreciated, by anyone beyond the small, hidden world that had chosen it. "Commander," Webb said, stepping up beside her, "Compact Scouts just confirmed the staging ground has stopped growing. No new construction activity in the last 3 weeks. Either they're finished building for now or they're getting ready to use what they've built," Reyes finished. "Either way, I think we're about to find out whether this alliance is strong enough to matter." Vex, who had joined the patrol as the alliance's senior civilian representative, stepped forward to study the latest sensor feed alongside them. "There is something else in the report," she said. "A single vessel, larger than the scout ships we fought at Farron's Rest, has separated from the staging ground and is holding position at its outer edge, not advancing, not retreating, simply waiting." "Waiting for what?" Webb asked. "I do not know," Vex admitted. "But I suspect, given everything we have learned about this enemy's patience, that it is not a coincidence. Something changed when their scouting force failed to return from Farron's Rest. Perhaps this is their answer to that failure. Perhaps it is something else entirely. We will not know until we are close enough to see for ourselves." Reyes studied the display for a long moment, weighing the risk of pressing closer against the cost of turning back without answers the alliance badly needed. "Helm," she said finally, "adjust course. Take us within long-range sensor distance of that vessel, but no closer, not yet. I want eyes on it before we decide anything else." The fleet altered course as one, a maneuver that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Dozens of ships from a dozen different species responding to a single order with the same practiced coordination a purely human fleet might have managed on its own. Reyes felt a quiet, cautious pride watching it happen. Proof that 6 months of hard work training and fighting side by side had built something real, something that might, if it held, prove strong enough for whatever waited ahead. As the fleet drew closer, the single vessel at the edge of the staging ground resolved slowly on the main display, larger than any scout ship from the earlier battle, but smaller than the Sovereign itself, its design unfamiliar in ways that made Reyes's instincts prickle with caution. It made no move to advance, no move to retreat, no attempt at communication on any frequency the fleet's systems could detect. It simply held its position, as if waiting to be noticed, or perhaps waiting to see what the fleet approaching it would choose to do next. "No weapons signature," Webb reported after several tense minutes of analysis. "No shields active that we can detect. If this is some kind of trap, it's not shaped like any trap in our tactical library. Maybe it's not a trap, Reyes said slowly. Maybe it's a message. The beacon we found a century ago was left by a dead civilization, warning whoever found it about what was coming. Maybe this is the swarm's version of the same thing. A single ship, left in plain sight, meant to say something we haven't figured out how to hear yet. Vex considered this. Then perhaps it is time we found a way to listen. Reyes looked at the vessel a moment longer, weighing months of careful alliance building against the very real risk of losing everything to a mistake made in a moment of overconfidence. Prepare a probe, she said finally. Passive sensors only, no weapons, no offensive systems of any kind. If they wanted to attack us, they've had every opportunity already, and haven't taken it. Let's find out what they actually want, before we decide this has to end the way the last encounter did. The probe launched a few minutes later, drifting slowly toward the waiting vessel, under careful watch from every ship in the fleet, and Reyes found herself holding her breath without quite meaning to, waiting to see whether this new chapter of the war would begin with more violence, or with something the galaxy badly needed and had not yet found: understanding. She looked out at the fleet spread across the display, human ships and compact ships flying together in formations built from 6 months of hard-won cooperation, born out of a battle that had nearly cost them everything, and had, in the end, given them something a century of silence never could: the certainty that they were not facing whatever came next alone. Send word to Earth and to the Compact Council both, she said. Tell them the silence is over, and it's staying over. Whatever comes out of that staging ground, we'll meet it together, the same way we met the first wave. That's the whole point of everything we spent 100 years building. Not to survive alone, to make sure nobody ever has to. Webb nodded and turned to send the message, and Reyes stood alone for a moment longer, watching the stars, watching the fleet, watching the future that 100 years of quiet, careful preparation had finally, truly begun. Behind her, on the small display near the command station that had once shown nothing but a single gray light on a star chart far away in a compact council chamber, that light now burned steady and bright among 100 others, no longer silent, no longer alone, and no longer, for the first time in a century, afraid of what the dark might still be hiding. The Sovereign sailed on into the unknown, and this time, it did not sail alone.